nin xumi dhalan rogi nafteeda midaan dhaqashaba aqooni intuu helay gaari dhowrsan muxuu cidla kaga dhaqaaqa intuu helay gaari dhowrsan muxuu cidla kaga dhaqaaqay muxuu dhalan dhoolu geystay muxuu qiil badan dhex joojay muxuu dhalan dhoolu geystay muxuu qiil badan dhex joojay muxuu marra dhaawa alla dhaawacuu baadaye muxuu dhalan dhoolu geystay muxuu qiil badan dhex joojay muxuu dhalan dhoolu geystay muxuu qiil badan dhex joojay muxuu marra dhaawa alla dhaawa muxuu inan dhool la moodo nin xumi dhalan rogi nafteeda midaan dhaqashaba aqooni intuu helay gaari dhowrsan muxuu cidla kaga dhaqaaqa intuu helay gaari dhowrsan muxuu cidla kaga dhaqaaqay muxuu dhalan dhoolu geystay muxuu qiil badan dhex joojay muxuu dhalan dhoolu geystay muxuu qiil badan dhex joojay muxuu marra dhaawa alla dhaawacuu baadaye muxuu dhalan dhoolu geystay muxuu qiil badan dhex joojay muxuu dhalan dhoolu geystay muxuu qiil badan dhex joojay muxuu marra dhaawa alla dhaawa muxuu inan dhool la moodo nin xumi dhalan rogi nafteeda midaan dhaqashaba aqooni intuu helay gaari dhowrsan muxuu cidla kaga dhaqaaqa intuu helay gaari dhowrsan muxuu cidla kaga dhaqaaqay muxuu dhalan dhoolu geystay muxuu qiil badan dhex joojay muxuu dhalan dhoolu geystay muxuu qiil badan dhex joojay muxuu marra dhaawa.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the music. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever you're joining us. And thank you so much for joining us today. I take this opportunity to welcome you to the official launch of SIHA Network's latest briefing paper titled, Is the Democratic Dream Still Possible? Navigating the Growing Backlash Against Women's Rights in Somaliland. I hope all of you can hear me clearly from wherever you are, from wherever you're joining. If you'd like to join the Somali channel, we have the interpretation button. Just click on Somaliland Hargeisa and then you mute original audio and you'll be able to join into the Somaliland Somali channel. I repeat, if you'd like to hear the Somali interpretation, please click on your interpretation button from your screen at the bottom of your screen, and then click on Somaliland Hargeisa and mute original audio, and you'll be able to listen to us in Somali. Again, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Shinaz Alizides. I work with SIHA Network as a Regional Grants and Capacity Building Coordinator. I'll be your moderator for today. We intend to have an interactive session today and to keep to the allocated time for our discussion. As we start, for over 3 decades, Somaliland has stood out in the Horn of Africa for its relative peace and stability, operating a multi-party electoral system for the past 22 years, and ensuring the right to vote for all its citizens. Throughout this particular period, women have played a vital role in the country's development, from leading reconciliation efforts in the early 1990s to contributing significantly to peace building and democratization. Yet, despite these contributions, women in Somaliland continue to face systemic marginalization rooted in deeply entrenched patriarchal structures that are exacerbated by religious fundamentalism and misinterpretation of Islamic Sharia. Over the past 2 years, we have seen a growing structural backlash against women's rights. Female activists, journalists, artists, and politicians have been subjected to harassment, detention, and even violence simply for advocating for democracy, human rights, and gender equality. This briefing paper examines these developments in depth, highlighting the gap between Somaliland's stated commitments and its actual practices, and presents very concrete recommendations that are aimed at reversing this very troubling trend. Against the backdrop of this briefing paper today, we'd want to have a pretty constructive dialogue on these particular trends, the lessons from other contexts, and how both government, civil society, development partners, and even the international community can work together to support the rights and dignity of all women in Somaliland. This particular briefing paper has been supported by the Komboa Consortium, which aims to resource and strengthen feminist resistance movements and collectives across Africa, enabling them to advance gender justice and be inclusive and more resilient to the attacks from anti-rights movements. Komboa is comprised of 5 different frontline African feminist organizations, which includes the African Women Development Fund, AWDF, Initiative Sankofa d'Afrique de l'Ouest, ISDAO, Purposeful, and the Dorias Feminist Fund. To kickstart this discussion, I would like to introduce our panel of speakers who are not only amazing in their own rights, but also have accumulated years of experience and practice in women's rights in Somaliland. Our first panelist for today is Guleid Ahmed Jama. Guleid is a lawyer based in Somaliland and a researcher at Maastricht University, the Faculty of Law, where he earned his PhD in 2024. With over 14 years of legal practice in Somaliland, Guleid has co-founded different civil society organizations and serves on the boards of both international and local NGOs that are focused on human rights and the rule of law. Our second panelist is Sagal Abas Bafo, who's a women's rights consultant working in fragile and conflict-affected contexts and has specialized in inclusive peace processes, peace building, social recovery, and post-conflict reconstruction. Sagal is also the founder of Adapt Localization Nexus, a global South women-led consultancy advancing localization and grassroots solutions in countries facing protracted crisis. We also have as a third panelist, Sadia Allin, who is the country director of Plan International in Somalia, with over 24 years of experience in the development and humanitarian sectors in Somalia, Ireland, Kenya, and the UK. Sadia also chairs the Somali NGO Consortium Steering Committee and is part of the INEE Steering Group. And she's also a lifelong advocate of women's human rights and education. And Sadia has also championed the campaign to end FGM since at a tender age of, from 11 years old. So like I said, they have rightfully and accumulated experience and practice within the movement, and you can see based on their bios. Our fourth panelist is going to be Sahra Abdi Hassan, who holds a degree in international relations and global governance from the College of the Holy Cross in Massachusetts, USA. Sahra has consulted for various organizations on GBV, women's political inclusion, peace and governance issues, and recently completed her master's in peace and conflict studies at the University of Hargeysa's Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. With that said, and the very impressive bios and work that I've read out from our panelists, I'd like to introduce and welcome Guleid to respond to our first question. So for those who are joining, as I stated earlier, we have a channel. If you'd like to listen to the interpretation, if you'd like to listen to the Somali interpretation, kindly go to the bottom of your screen. You click on interpretation, click on Somaliland, Hargeisa, and then mute your original audio, and you'll be able to listen into the Somali interpretation that we are offering today. So Guleid, just to quickly jump into our first question, maybe if you could let us know how is Somaliland's legal frameworks, how are the legal frameworks in Somaliland being used to suppress or support women's rights, and how do you think activists can effectively respond?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me in the webinar. The legal system of Somaliland largely consists of plurality of laws, meaning the state law, HER, which is clan laws, and Sharia law all apply in Somaliland. And Sharia and HER, clan laws, affect and impact and somehow influence the lawmaking process of the state law, but also how it is enforced and how it is interpreted. It is that interaction of the three legal systems that create complexities for the rights of women in terms of how it is defined. Do women have a right at all? And if state law provides and grants rights to women, how they should be interpreted or understood. And that's a very difficult situation for rights of women. Also, there are laws that predate the Constitution. So we have a Constitution that was approved in the year 2001. It is relatively progressive when it comes to human rights in general. It accepts equality and non-discrimination for all human beings in Somaliland, men and women, and has a special article that focuses on the rights of the women. But many laws that are applicable in Somaliland predate the Constitution and contradict the tenets of the Constitution. Also, there are areas where the law isn't written, and unwritten application of Sharia law is applied, which is not helpful for women. Thirdly, the lawmaking and enforcement mechanism in place in Somaliland excludes women in their leadership ranking. So you have a parliament, which is almost all men except one. You have a judiciary where women are not accepted as a judge. You have the law enforcement agencies, which are predominantly male-led. And such enforcement and lawmaking mechanism, therefore, do not take into account the rights of women in Somaliland. So it is very difficult, generally in Somaliland, to be a woman, more difficult to be a woman activist in Somaliland.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Guleid. I take your last note that it is very difficult to be a woman in Somaliland, and more so to be a women's human rights activist in Somaliland. So in terms of advocacy, how do you think criminalizing advocacy under laws like the Penal Code has affected the civil society? And what reforms do you feel are needed to protect the civic space within Somaliland? Because we all know that advocacy is very key in terms of, advocacy. Advocacy is very key in terms of, women's human rights and speaking out against it, and also in terms of the laws and the statutes that we want to pass. So how do you feel that these laws, and criminalization of advocacy affects the civil society?
Yes, the Constitution is clear in terms of its support for civic rights and people to organize themselves, right to assembly, right to association, right to demonstrate, all of that are enshrined in the Constitution. But there are laws that predate the Constitution, like the one you have mentioned, the Penal Code. It goes back to Italy under Benito Mussolini. So it is a very authoritarian, very repressive law that criminalizes almost every aspect of civic activity. So if the prosecution wants to put you in prison for the most basic activity of an activist, they will find a law, they will find a provision within the Penal Code. So it is a big problem. It criminalizes freedom of speech, it criminalizes assembly, it criminalizes demonstrations, it puts a lot of challenge in organizing yourself in any form of civic space. It's very difficult law. That criminalization contradicts the Constitution and international human rights law, which the Constitution has endorsed. It needs to be reformed urgently. The Constitution was approved in 2001. That is over 20 years now. There is no reason Somaliland to keep such problematic law in place. But it's not only the law, it is the mentality, it's the thinking that it has created over the past 40 years. It's more than 40 years. It was enacted in 1963. So there's a couple of decades in place, which made enforcement institutions very repressive. And, the thinking, the mentality of criminalizing activities is very deeper in Somaliland government institutions.
All right. Thank you so much, Guleid. Just a reminder for those who are joining us. Just a reminder for those who are joining us, kindly introduce yourself in the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know from where you're joining us, the country and the organization that you're joining us from. You can write in Somali if you'd want. Feel free to also join the Somali if you are comfortable with that. So just to get to understand this further, Guleid, with the rising state-led restrictions on civil society, and this also relates to the previous question that I asked on how the penal code, affects the civil society. So what do you feel are the key legal implications of tactics that have been used by the government, like the arrests? We've seen the arrests of the journalists, of of activists, of artists, of politicians, the harassment, and the legitimization. What do you think are the real legal implications of these tactics that the government is using?
These tactics have a very negative implications on people. For example, one example is the NGO registration and renewal process, which is very cumbersome, which imposes organizations to renew their existence annually and has to report to the authorities. And it is often used as a way to somehow negatively influence Somaliland NGOs, international local NGOs. Who do they give donation when it comes to international NGOs? So the NGOs Act, which is the most basic in terms of mobilization of civil society groups, is problematic and has a tool to suppress civil society groups in Somaliland. Arrests are very common in journalists, but also people who express themselves against the government critically. The state laws, like the penal code, criminal procedure, but also state institutions are often used by state authorities like governors and mayors to suppress the individuals they don't like, but also organizations they don't like. So you go to a region outside of Hargeisa, the governor there has many powers, like what you need to do, what you don't need to do. But also there's the issue of mixing morality with law enforcement, which is becoming problematic here in Somaliland, but more problematic to women. You mentioned women artists, musicians. They are facing challenges because of that mix, where religious leaders are coming up with morality codes, and law enforcement agencies are enforcing them without legal grounds to do so. So these are the tactics they use, which are common to Somalilanders. Of course, there's a new government now that came into power in December last year. We don't see big change in terms of plan of what they want to do, but we are hopeful they might learn from the past, and they should reform institutions and laws in order to accommodate civic space in Somaliland, but also to provide women more protection, women activists and women in general more protection.
Okay. Thanks, Guleid. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. Ask any questions you'd want to Guleid, and then we'll take them during the Q&A session. We'll have once all the panelists have had a chance to go through this. Guleid, I'd just like to have a bit of clarity. So when you say mixing morality with law enforcement, what does that exactly look like? What do you mean by that?
For instance, in this report, you cited a musician, who was arrested by the police and taken to court. And the allegation was that she was acting immorally. And it was said by religious leaders who were pushing the case, and it was enforced by the police and the courts. These have no legal base whatsoever, but the dictates of a religious leader, conservative man mostly, who see something as irreligious or against immorality, is being enforced by the law enforcement agencies, which is basically not in conformity with the constitution, because a crime should be divided by a written law, not by morality.
All right. Just as we move on swiftly, thank you so much, Guleid. We'll come back to you when we get questions from the participants and from the members. I'm sure there are people who'd like to know more about the legal frameworks as well as the legal implications of such tactics by the government. So we'll come back to you. But on that note, on the note of morality, mixing morality with law enforcement and harassing artists and activists, musicians, poets, journalists as well, I think this is a good stage for us to then move to Sadia. Sadia, one of the things we'd like to know from you, especially now that we're looking at, the use of religion harass women. So how would you say religious and nationalistic rhetoric has impacted your work on girls' education and protection? And what counter narratives have you been using that have actually worked?
Sorry, it seems like your voice has been fading, and also I have the prayers in the background.
All right. So I'll repeat that,
Then, yeah.
Sadia. I'll
Yes.
repeat the question, because Guleid has spoken to us about how the government is now mixing morality and using religion to harass women, to harass activists and artists. So how, in your experience and from the work that you do, how has religious and nationalistic rhetoric impacted your work on girls' education and protection? And what exact counter narratives, if you have used any, have worked for you?
Thank you so much. Yes, FGM is linked to cultural and religious practices, and that makes it connected when the civic space is really shrinking. You know what happens when FGM advocates or the activists, they want to speak about FGM, they are often suffer from suppression, from censorship, from unaccountable government. And most of the time what happens to them, they don't have any background supporters to stand for their cause, for the reason in campaign, and they actually suffer alone. So, and when the civic space shrinks, then it becomes more problematic for them. And that also increases the continuation of the FGM. For us, what has been working is that making anti-FGM agenda as local as possible, enabling young people, young female activists in the front line, making sure that they have the necessary knowledge, because most of the time what happens, people, they are not aware of FGM and religion, how they are related and how
Sadia, could you kindly please speak up, and if maybe if I could repeat the question, and so that you because I feel maybe I wasn't very clear on the question. So it would be good to understand from your end, how has religious and nationalistic rhetoric impacted your work on girls' education and protection? How has the rhetoric on, the use of religion impacted your work, and what counter narratives have exactly worked?
I think it is the voice and also the background, and I also feel uncomfortable. The brain is going in my background talking.
Sorry about that.
Yes, I think it has been quite clear for us that the recent backlash of religious fundamentalists and nationalists, not only at Somaliland level, but globally, has implications on our work, where you are told girls, they have to be at home, they have to be minding the family business and taking care of the family chores. So it has implications, but what we have been doing as a counter effect was that ensuring that we are fully aware of the rights of girls in religion, and actually inviting some moderate religious leaders, ensuring that they speak up, talk about the issues, and actually give confidence to the activists, because sometimes if you don't have that religious backing, it is easy for you to be break down by the society's narrative and the way they see issues. So we have been working with the religious leaders, ensuring that they work with the young people. We have a number of programs that in support is the survivors' voice. For instance, like myself, speaking about FGM is a personal, it's not only my professional work. So bringing that personal and reality on the table and ensuring that it's not something that we extract somewhere or impose somewhere else. it is our life. So that has been really working well, and that has been really effective strategy. But yes, we have suffered a great deal of these recent, I wouldn't say recent, but it has been coming for many years now, when we have seen the girls' rights is becoming the agenda of the NGOs, of the civil society, of more liberal people. Then we have seen that backlash here.
All right. Thank you, Sadia. Thank you for that. So in terms of the work that you do at Plan International, how do you feel, and also to speak to maybe if you have any other international organizations that are joining us today in this particular forum, how do you think international organizations can support local women's rights movements without it looking like they're being the foreign agent, or bringing foreign narratives within the movement? And if this is something you've done, what challenges have you faced in this particular space as someone who works within Plan International?
I think number one, we have to recognize FGM as one of the most extreme manifestations of violence, and it violates multi-rights. And that brings us together as human rights defenders, and ensuring that we are collective and we are coordinating our message. If you look back in the past, uncoordinated message from the NGO community, both internationals and locals, has resulted a confusion for the community, which of FGM practice they should abandon. If you have heard the word chronic, is associated with one of the most extreme ones or procedures, but it's still cut is cut. And that has resulted because of the ununified message. So what we have been doing is that creating a coordination mechanisms, working with the local activists, with the government, with the religious groups to unify, number one, the voices. Secondly, identify areas of collaboration where we can create synergies and build collaboration. So we will not concentrate resources into one place. One thing also we have learned from the past is that FGM is not something that you can do as a standalone. You have to mainstream to existing programs, because the community will not listen to you as they see it is not relevant for their needs. So you have to work with WASH cluster to ensure when they're talking about water with the community, they have to include FGM message. You have to work with food security, so they include their food security message and nutrition. So we have been ensuring that we strategize our voices in different mechanisms and make sure that our message goes to different channels. The other thing was that has been working for the international organizations, particularly like PLAN. FGM is not only Somaliland or Somalia or African problem, it's a global problem. So bringing international community on the board to put a pressure on the Somaliland government to enact policies that end FGM was also one of the areas that was really working well, and we felt it's working. And we need, as an international organization, is to ensure that we are coming from different countries in terms of our organizations. So we have that political leverage to put a pressure on the government and actually translate those pressures into actual practice on the ground. We understand there are not much funding for FGM and in FGM campaigns, so ensuring advocacy towards the international communities in contribution to end FGM. So those have been the strategies that we have been doing. And also, one thing I want to also highlight, man's inclusion in the fight. Men are not only the people that those kind of horrendous practices are happening, but also they hold such a powerful role in the society where they can bring up transformative change in the community. So we engage with them, we work with them, especially young men who can become the second leaders for tomorrow, who can be the fathers and the husbands. And Yeah, so I feel managed inclusion was also effective way that we need to pursue.
All right. Thank you so much, Sadia. In terms of FGM, if we go back to FGM that you've just spoken about, like what challenges, what challenges have you, I know you've spoken of the challenges, but what strategies do you feel are effective? You've spoken of, inclusion of men in the fight, but in terms of looking at the backlash that you receive in Somaliland and how that has affected your work, especially with the girls. So what strategies have you seen that have worked apart from the ones that you've just mentioned right now? Are there other strategies that you find very effective that other people can take home?
I think I've mentioned few, but to add on the strategies that have worked for us, sometimes you need to be strategic in terms of when your advocacy will make it the most effective. So sometimes going in the public speaking about issues is effective, but also sometimes background campaign lobbying can be also equally effective. So in speaking with the policymakers, although unfortunately for the anti-FGM policy has been in draft for 11 years, and now with the from the last minute they have approved. The one thing I really appreciate with this new government is that they have taken the commitment to take this policy forward. So pursuing and the policy enactment was also one of the things that we felt has worked for us. In this backlash, yes, as I said, other activists, they have supporters, but when political civic space shrinks, the momentum to end FGM campaigns become smaller, and activists, they become increasingly vulnerable. We could be easily intimidated. Sometimes some of our activists, including myself, have been called by this Haiti. And actually, it's not something that you can publicly raise, because even for the community leaders that you are representing, they are not speaking for you because you are not politically arrested. You are not something else. It's something that's also deeply strong in their culture, and they preserve, and they will not be protecting you. So yes, I believe the anti-FGM advocates and activists have suffered more, but their suffering has never been documented and has never been protected and never been supported. Something that we need to take into account in the future. Something I would like to share with my international local organizations in this call, to ensure that we also document the challenges and the censorship, the intimidations that anti-FGM activists they face.
Okay, that's a very key takeaway, Sadia. Documentation as part of our work that we do, we know that in terms of our advocacy, documentation has been really helpful. It's really helped us in the work that we do, and it's something that if we take if we are keen on it, it'll really help us yield a lot of fruits. And it's something that we need to, as activists, as we go back home, think about it. How do we document the suffering, like you've said, of the FGM activists? So maybe that is something we can discuss later on and look at. But something that you've mentioned, and Guleid also mentioned, is the new government. And it would be interesting, maybe we can discuss it later on. It would be interesting to know what window of opportunity is there, with the new government that has come in, and how can activists, civil society organizations, and even the international community come in, to take advantage of the momentum that's there. So thank you so much, Sadia. Participants, kindly feel free to share your questions. If you're joining just now, we have the Somali channel at the bottom of your screen. You can click on interpretation, and then you click on Somaliland Hargeisa, and you mute your original. Feel free to type in your questions and also write to us and let us know where you're joining us from which organization, and from which country as well. We move on to our next next panelist, we have Sagal, who, as you mentioned before, is a women's rights and nexus consultant. So Sagal I believe you will take us through your presentation, but I'll quickly read through your 3 questions. So I would like to know from your experience in terms of working in Somalia and Yemen, both of them very fragile contexts. So how does backlash in Somaliland compare, and what lessons could we get to help support women's rights defenders in Somaliland? Because both of them, as I've mentioned, are very fragile contexts, and we've seen a lot of activists even coming out to speak out against harassment and the retrogressive laws that are there. So how can we take those lessons to Somaliland? And then the other thing maybe you could touch on is given the rising suspicion of donor-backed gender work, how can we decolonize locally led approaches be restructured to better protect grassroots women's movements in Somaliland? And for us, grassroots women movements are very key because we believe a lot of power lies in the grassroots women movements. And
Absolutely.
if we support them, they'll be able to, to help with this agenda, the women's rights agenda that we're trying to push forward. And then the last thing maybe you could speak to us about is on women, peace and security, the women, peace and security framework. How can that be localized in Somaliland so that we avoid it being seen as a Western agenda, especially given the Somaliland context where, religion is used, to infringe on women's rights, where anything that is new that is brought in is seen as a Western agenda. So how can we localize this WPS framework so that it suits the Somaliland context? Over to you, Sagal.
Absolutely. I'm not sure who is sharing my screen, but Rashida
There
and
it is.
Sandra they have, okay. Are you sharing the screen, right?
Yes, we're sharing
Okay,
the screen.
perfect. I'm not sure if that's the latest one, but it's okay.
It is.
I think it is amazing. Great. So thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion. And I have 10 minutes. It's a big questions conversation on women's rights.
I'm sure you'll do fine.
I will, and I will speak fast as well. So maybe if you can just go on to the next
maybe not so
slide.
fast because we have the interpreter, so that the interpreter is also able to catch up, and the people who are joining from the Somali channel are also able to get a gist of what you're saying and are able to pose their questions to us later on. Thank you.
Okay, great. So maybe if you can go on to the first slide, if that's okay. So Yemen, Somalia, Somaliland, 3 different dynamics, but all countries that are currently facing similar issues. So as we know, women's rights globally is always at risk, but there is something quite unique when we think about countries like Yemen and Somalia and Somaliland, is because first we have the dynamics around religious conservatism. We also have patriarchy norms, clan religious dynamics and political structures. Then also we have the insecurity and violence that also impacts women's rights and the way we are able to address some of the issues around gender inequality. Then you also have shrinking civic space. So myself, I work in all dynamics, and I've noticed that while different gendered issues are happening, I realized that we have the same dynamics and we also can have the same response. So if I can just move on to Somalia first, if that's okay. Yes. With Somalia, we know that 30 years of lack of strong government, institutions, and legal systems, gender and women's rights issue has been one of the biggest issues facing women and girls nationally. And whether it's conflict, humanitarian crisis, and also you have the exclusion on the political level. So I just wanted to narrow down, mainly focusing on the political dynamics. So in 2020, Somalia nearly passed one of the most regressive pieces of legislation. So this is called the Sexual Intercourse Related Crimes Bill. So this legislation, apparently what it was trying to do, which was completely against human rights, was that it wanted to legalize child marriage. So once a girl reaches puberty, also it raised any protection issues for protection mechanisms for survivors of rape and sexual assault. This move came about after years of advocacy for a more progressive sexual offense bill, which was actually put forward in 2018. So in 2018, there was a cabinet approval, which essentially for the women's rights organization was symbolic. But what happened in 2020 was that there was an opposing to say that actually we're going to go completely against what women's rights organization was trying to advocate for. So what this was trying to do as well is trying to say that women's body did not belong to us. But what I found really interesting is that there was a lot of mobilization amongst women's rights organization, activists, and essentially trying to create noise about what was happening. But what we witnessed is that there was a lot of backlash. So we saw that women's
Sagal,
activists.
just a moment. If you could kindly just go a bit slowly, because the interpreter is having a bit of a challenge to catch up.
Absolutely. As a
Yes.
British person, I realize we talk so fast, so I will talk slow. In response to this bill, when this cabinet bill was trying to essentially put forward this bill that would eventually impact women and girls, a lot of mobilization took place, but a lot of women's activists was trying to say that they were being harassed. A few was also trying to say that their phone was being surveilled, and essentially was trying to put them from trying to advocate against this. There was a well-known Mogadishu women's rights activist that received a lot of death threats after appearing on a radio show. In Beledweyne, also a grassroots activist was warned and against GBV awareness raising. And essentially a lot of women's activists was basically telling us that while they wanted to advocate against it, their security was at threat. So while the bill itself was not ratified, it essentially created this atmosphere to remind women's activists to say, you don't have a space, right? You were going to essentially do anything that we want, and nor can you have a space to advocate against this. If you can go on to the next slide. Even when women activists are even trying to participate on the political level, there's also backlash against that. So when we think about women's rights defenders, we need to also remember there are women's rights defenders in political, social, and community level, right? So on the political level, a lot of female women political organizers were deliberately blocked from consultation. They were labeled as foreign agents for questioning the clan-dominated system. They were cut off from meetings. And also, while we know women activists, especially those who are politically advocating for participation, behind the scenes they're doing a lot of work, but they also have the fear that if they are speaking openly, they are going against religion, and they're also going against the traditional structures at hand. Exclusion is not an oversight. It's not something that just happened as a strategy. So while women's visibility might be tolerated, power is not. Also, we need to keep in mind that women journalists and women's rights organizations also face a lot of backlash for speaking on women's issue. For example, if we take the women's journalists in Mogadishu who are reporting rape cases, they're often facing threats and also the reputation that are essentially damaged online. Also, if we keep in mind, between 2020 and 2022, women's rights defenders were being arrested, similar to what our colleague mentioned around molarity laws. Also, many are accused of shaming their communities for simply advocating for women's rights. Also, I would like to mention, we don't really think about women's rights organization at the community level who are also doing the work, because in 2022, there was a GBV center in Baidoa that was essentially raided, and their materials were confiscated. And a lot of the staff and organizations are essentially labeled as doing the work of the Westerners. So if you think about it, they're having the threat from the social political dynamics. Also, when we think about Al-Shabaab and the threat that comes from them. So essentially, it's all coming from different angles. A lot of organizations, both in Yemen and in Somalia, are trying to do a lot of documentation, but even that comes with threat and insecurity. If we can go on to the next slide, if that's okay. Now moving on to Yemen. Yemen also is a unique situation because before the conflict, there was a lot of gender inequality. Women did not really participate in social political spaces. But then what happened after the war is that the traditional roles have changed. So a lot of women and young girls activists was trying to utilize the space that became available to them. But what happened was that while they had the enormous challenge to promote gender equality, address peace building, really promote women's rights voices, they also had to deal with the increased harassment and the criminalization of their advocacy. So if we look at both the North and the South, in the Houthi side, you had a lot of women's rights activists who were being arrested under, again, morality. An example of this was Intisar, a Yemeni actress who was sentenced to 5 years. She didn't have any access to legal support. And essentially what she was being accused of was promoting Western and immorality, which was completely incorrect. Also in the southern part, you also had a lot of women's organizations who were receiving funding from the donors or international community that was being perceived as promoting Western values. An example actually that I have, and I'm sorry if I'm speaking too fast, a women's organization that I'm working with, we had a Women, Peace and Security program, 5-year program that was funded by the Dutch. But what we were trying to do was change the words, right? But what we recognized that at the start of the program, even the use of gender was in a way causing some issues. So there was a booklet that was being circulating around the community. It came about after a sheikh was accusing women's organizations, so the one that I was working with and a few others, has promoting values that did not align with Islam. We were also bringing Yemeni women activists to Europe for them to party and to do many things, which was incorrect information. And as a result of that, some of our meetings, our community events was not only being disturbed, but was also being promoted as, like, for example, our information on an event was being shared around. Sometimes Islamic sheikhs would come to the event and like end up stopping it. So we found that at the start of the program, we had so many of these issues. Also the same with like individual peace activists are forced into hiding. With Yemen, I think the same also with Somalia. There's a lot of online campaigns that are happening, especially in the last few years. So they could essentially share your information, your address, the faces of activists, organizations' addresses. And this is, in a way, is directly impacting our safety, but it also has indirect long-term impact on gender equality and women's rights advocacy, and also the narrative that comes about, which is extremely challenging. So for me personally, something that I've noticed both Yemen and in Somalia is that the use of like morality laws and cultural norms, which is essentially it's not a norm that is fixed. It's something that is being promoted by those who are not supporting women's rights or women's participation. If we go into the next slide, I realize I am going, I think, over time, but this is my last slide. If we see, and I want to go back onto referencing Somaliland and the research that was done, similar dynamics. Women who are speaking in the time of political discussion are being arrested and basically being utilized as a way to, as a reminder to other women's activists to say that you shouldn't be talking, this is not your right. But we also have to keep in mind that attack on women's rights are not spontaneous. I mean, it's spontaneous, but it is predictable. So we know that maybe in 5 months in time, if we know that there is a conference being organized by, let's say, a traditional leader, we know that after that, there's going to be an increase of attack on women's rights and activists. Also, we know there's common tactics of religious framing of terminologies within our programming, and we know that there is direct violation on women's security and freedom. I'm more personally, I'm more interested in the question in what do we do now? What is the next step? So through the work that we are doing with women's rights organization is that what we're trying to do is prediction. So we're trying to have early warning and early response. So like I mentioned, we know that in a year from now, maybe there's going to be an increase because of this examples. We're also conducting mapping of religious leaders, community leaders. So far, we have actually done a lot of trainings with religious sheikhs in Yemen, and they are the ones who are now becoming advocates. So if there is a smear campaign that is happening, they are the ones that are going to do a community meeting and really address this problem. We recognize that instead of just having a women right defender and put their feasibility open, we're also trying to embed them into existing structures. We shouldn't just have a vocal point who is going to have the pressure to deal with everything. But if, for example, we have a women's rights defender within a community committee, for example, she has a group of people to support her. If we are also supporting a women's political activist within a network, she also has a team to support her. Over the last few years, we have been changing our programming name. So instead of having Women, Peace and Security, we are naming it as Community Empowerment or Community Strengthening. So that way we don't get attacked, nor do we have our activities stopped. Maybe just a few more points that I'd like to mention.
I'll give you a minute.
Yes, decolonization. I think what we need to do is step away from the European WPS approach and reframe it in our own narrative. So I would like to see, for example, more grassroots localized approach. We need to create a contextualized. We don't want to shame our religious leaders. We don't want to shame our men in our community, but we need to use them as our fellow comrades. And I also would like to say storytelling, poetry, and oral tradition has a way to create safe spaces. And also, like I mentioned, tailored emergency flexible funding. We keep mentioning this all the time in all our webinars, but we actually need to create one that is focusing on global South women human rights defenders that are having to deal with culture, religion, and many other barriers to the work we're doing at the moment. I finished now, and I hope that's summarized well in the translation.
All right. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Sagal. Just before we move on, I know I had mentioned that we'll take the Q&A later on, but there's one important question that I feel maybe you could just quickly respond to. So someone has asked, Suad Nur has asked, where is the bill today? And I believe they're referencing the sexual offences bill.
Both bill has actually paused. So they haven't been ratified, it hasn't been pushed forward. And this is the conversation that we're having now amongst our own network. Because I'm part of the Somali Women's Rights Network, we're trying to now think about, can we revise the bill and really put this forward? Because I think the backlash that took place has kind of limited or in a way, it kind of damaged the mobilization and momentum amongst women's rights activists in Somalia because of what could happen. But the difference I would like to say is that now I think there has to be coordinated mobilization.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Sagal. What I picked from your submission and what Sadia has mentioned as well is the one of the strategies that you find useful is the use of men, engaging the men in some of the approaches that you use. But also, I found it interesting. You mentioned the early warning systems, and I find that very interesting as well, because it's something at SIHA Network that we've also used in different countries and different contexts and has worked for us as well. So as we move on, still on the next presenter, on the next panelist, we have Sahra Hassan, who's a program coordinator for WTI Somaliland. And Sahra is also going to have a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation. Sahra, I'll just quickly go through your 3 questions, and I'm assuming that you'll cover all 3 questions in your presentation, and also keep to time because it looks like we have about 30 minutes or so to go. So the first question, Sahra, that I'd be interested for you to tackle is how are women-led organizations in Somaliland continuing their work, especially on governance and peace building amidst the shrinking civic space? So how are they strategizing? How are they, doing their advocacy efforts? How are they, even existing within the civic space that continues to shrink? And then what role do you believe, as a young woman, what role do you believe that young activists and institutions like the University of Hargeisa can play in shaping the future of women's rights leadership under the current pressures that we are seeing and that we're witnessing in Somaliland? And then the third question, the final and third question would be, we're still sticking on this Western agenda because we find it very interesting, and it's something that if we tackle, we feel that it will be a step towards dealing with the backlash that is there, especially now that a lot of the work that we are doing is being labeled as a Western agenda. So how do you feel that the framing of of gender equality as a Western agenda impacted local advocacy, especially among the youth and educated women, and what grassroots strategies have been effective in countering it? Strategies that you yourself has used in your organization, in your own context as a young woman. What strategies have worked, in fighting against this particular rhetoric that gender equality is a Western agenda? Sarah?
Awesome, thank you, everyone. Can you hear me fine?
Maybe if you could speak a little bit louder. Feel free, please, to share your questions, pose your questions. We'll look at them immediately after this. We'll come back to the questions. If you have any question for Sarah, for Sadia, for Sagal, for Guleid, feel free to pose your questions so that we look at them. We respond to them later on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shines. I trust that you guys can hear me.
Perfectly.
Awesome, wonderful. Thank you again for the SIHA Network team and for everyone who's on this call. I wanted to quickly go through the term civic space because I feel like it is the focus of SIHA's current research, but it is also a term that gets often combined with other terms and can be a bit confusing. So civic space is a term that in its most basic definition means the ability of people, so individuals and groups, to exercise their freedom of speech and expression, whether that's through art, poetry, filmmaking, writing, whatever that form might be, but the absolute freedom to be able to express your and feelings, emotions, what might be, and also the ability to assemble or groups who have the same agendas, the same issues, to come together in public and publicly express the issues that they are supporting or not supporting. And then the third term within the civic space umbrella is the freedom or the ability to associate. So for individuals and groups to have platforms, organizations, associations where they can come together and further engage with their interests and with their interests. But the big term here is the ability to do all those three things without fear. So without fear from from the government or any other outside threat. Being able to express, to assemble, associate without worry. There's a term that I feel like is often used in our spaces and in talking about conversations, which is civil society organization. And civil society organization is an actor, one of the actors within the civic space. Other actors can be human rights defenders is a term that we use, journalists, any actor who is non-governmental doesn't associate with the government, so to say, can be termed non-governmental. Where a civic space is the environment, the frameworks that allow them to participate, to allow those actors to participate in public life. So I feel like now that term is cleared, hopefully a bit. Some of the challenges that civic actors face can come from companies and corporations, for example. There was a study that we were doing on civic space a few months back in Somaliland and Somalia, and one of the participants there kind of talked about how in Somaliland, at least media companies and media houses are being heavily influenced by private companies. So for instance, these companies are, paying for ads and paying for programs and things like that. And as a result, media houses and journalists in general are too afraid to take on those private companies or to highlight any issues or problems or challenges that they may be causing, mainly because, you know, they kind of depend on their financial support and their investments. So that's one way that corporations are influencing, you know, a civil actor, which is media or like journalist groups. Other challenges can come from different groups. So terrorist groups are one. Government organizations are another one. Have seen, you know, different policies can heavily affect the ability for civil society organizations, for women groups, for other form of civil organizations to assemble, to associate, to kind of talk about issues of public interest. Can you move to the next slide, please? Shinaz? Okay, awesome, thank you. This is a long document, but it's an excerpt from research that we've been doing recently, assessing like Somaliland civic space. And what we were doing was kind of evaluating what the civic space looks like on different areas. Regulatory frameworks, access to funding, those type of, the lists of the issues that you see here. And as you can see on each bullet point, there's a number that associates with it. That number, we were trying to give a specific number to how either open or restrictive the civic space or frameworks in Somaliland is. So 0 being very restrictive, 10 being enabling. So for instance, regulatory frameworks, for instance, is 6 to 7, which has been trained as a positive, element. But with that being said, there's been discussions where when it comes to regulatory issues and frameworks, a lot of media houses are having a big challenge when it comes to licensing and being able to operate as media houses. Another big challenge, at least in the Somaliland context, is there's only one radio station that is operating, and for the past 30-something years, that one radio station is governed by it's government run, and no other radio station is allowed to operate. So that is one of the restrictions that are discussed in those conversations. Because the list is very long and there's very different areas, I want to focus on the areas that have been asked to comment on, which in this case, the first question was related to how women groups are functioning with the shrinkage of funding, at least in the Somaliland. So there's been like a decline in donor appetite for the past 5 years or so, not more. And this is due to a few reasons. In most recent cases, the Ukraine conflict, so the Ukraine war and the Sudan conflict definitely shifted donors' attention and funding to those two crises, because naturally they are big emergencies that need to be attended to. But that shifting of priorities have also impacted funding for other programs in Somalia. So Somaliland has become less of a priority because we have seen a lot of donors saying, hey, this is the Sudan conflict, is a bigger crisis. We need to allocate a lot more resources here. So there's been a decline of funding pools as a result of bigger emergencies. But there's also a more of a rising issue where these nationalist leaders are coming to power in Europe and also most recently in the United States. And what that has caused is a shift in national priorities, specifically on humanitarian and development programs.
Sarah,
The impact of that being
Sarah,
there is
if I
less.
may, you have about 2 minutes to go.
Oh,
Okay.
wow, that went very fast. So there's less. There's less organizations, women groups or otherwise, have less funds coming in, which means there's fewer. The impact is much fewer. they have less influence, they have less agency, and far more, they're irrelevant because they can't operate as well as they used to. The one opportunity that I can see from the coming out of the shrinkage of funding and the shutdown of US AD programs is we could see a less dependency on donor funds, communities kind of pooling their resources together, CSR, corporate social responsibility programs, like locally where, you know, big companies like Telesom or Somaliland, for instance, in the Somaliland case, can be asked to contribute to the country's development, which could be far more sustainable. I could also see the point on, like, you know, organizations being Western focused, that critique is coming from a mismatch of funds and community needs. So now that we don't have restricted funds and we don't have donor, you know, guidelines, community resources can be allocated where they need to be, and the government can have more role. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, as well for keeping time. I've taken quite a lot from your presentation, and it's good that you've spoken to you know, the Western agenda and how as well young women and youth, you know, can put in place strategies to counter this particular narrative. So I'd like to open up the room for questions. I know there are a couple of people who posted questions. Some people have put up their hands. You can put up your hands as well if you have any questions. But before we get to that, so I have about 10 minutes for Q&A. And I'd like to go first with the first question to Guleid. Guleid, someone has posed a question. So Nuruddin posed a question to you and asked, is there a specific law or policy that restricts women's participation in democracy? Is there a specific law or policy that restricts women participation in democracy? And does liberal democracy work effectively in Somaliland? So I'll post the question as well in the chat. So Guleid, maybe if you could take a minute to respond to this question.
Oh, yeah, thank you. There is no law that expressly and explicitly says women cannot participate, but there are laws that do have barriers, the laws that do hinder women's access to participation in democracy. So, for instance, the Elections Act includes clauses that, unless they are removed, will not permit women to effectively and meaningfully participate in elections. So these are indirect clauses within the law, but not expressly, of course.
And Guleid, the other question is that, do you feel liberal democracy works effectively in Somaliland?
It is very difficult to explain or even define what do we mean liberal democracy. But if democracy is working in Somaliland, it is working, but it is with a lot of challenge, particularly in gender equality, but also in so many other issues, freedom of speech, media expression. It has challenged, but in one way it is also working. So it is a work in progress. We need to do more if we want to make it work effectively.
All right. Thanks, Guleid. Abdi has posed a question, so I'd say any of the panelists that feel comfortable would be able to respond to this. So Abdi poses that while women in Somaliland face widespread marginalization, minority women and girls with disabilities experience compounded forms of discrimination and vulnerability. These groups are often deprived of access to basic services and resources. What strategies can we implement to ensure targeted support and inclusion for these highly marginalized populations? What strategies can we implement to ensure targeted support and inclusion for these highly marginalized populations? I'm not sure of the panelists that we have. Sarah, Sagal, Sadia, Guleid, is there anyone of you who would like to take to have a go at this question?
Yes, I wouldn't
Sagal,
mind,
okay.
that's okay. Only because I find this question really important because it's talking about intersectionality too, because women, yes, we suffer a lot of similar issues, but then you have disability issues, minority. And I think the first thing what we need to do, whether it's civil society or networks, is really conduct an analysis that is continuously updated about the unique needs and experiences of minority women and those with disability, because we cannot respond without understanding. So IDP women and girls with disability, or it could be a minority IDP, or it could be women with those identities, but from a poor background. And I think what is really important is that when we design programs, when we are designing our advocacy, we need to really make sure that we're able to create pathways for those that are able to interact with what we are doing. But I also want to mention one key point as well. If, for example, in Somalia, we had an issue where women IDPs had lack of legal access, whether they were being evicted, also that they didn't have service access as well. So it meant that within our programming, we knew that they had to have a unique, tailored response to it. But it also meant that we had to work with the national stakeholders, the legal authority, the systems at hand. So it meant that we had to do advocacy awareness raising with those who are essentially duty bearers, those who are able to respond to their own unique needs. So I think what's really important, especially in this, is that you need multiple stakeholder, you need an in-depth analysis of their needs, and then you also need a tailored response that also keeps on updating every time based on their own needs.
All right, that sounds good. Tailored approaches, design programs that are inclusive as well, and also engage multiple stakeholders. Abdi, I'm hoping that has responded appropriately to your question. We also have Manal.
Can I add also one thing for that?
Yes, just a minute.
Yeah,
Okay.
disability and minority, they have also very close, they are close to my heart. And I just want to mention, over the period we have been saying inclusion, and we have never seen it done properly. So what we need is to have that cap, like 5%, 10%, 30% of Black minority, Black disability. So having that cap in the proposals, in the engagement, in that whatever we are doing, we should have that marked percentage for people from minorities and with a disability.
Thank you, Sadia. So numbers are key, numbers are important. Before we go on to Omaima has raised her hand. Lorna, thank you for joining us. I see you've excused yourself. We are almost at the tail end of our discussion. But before we go on to the other question, to the second last question, just to let you know that we shall be posting, we shall be putting up a post-evaluation form for you to fill in English, both in English and Somali. Kindly feel free to key in your input, give us your thoughts and feelings about this particular session. We'll post that in the chat or post a link for you to be able to click on and fill in the questions. So the other question that we received was from Manal regarding FGM. FGM is one of the challenges. One of the challenges is the awareness message. In Sudan, and for more than 6 decades, we address FGM in health and religion, which do not work. This is why Salima initiative comes on board to emphasize the gender dimension. A new message has been developed. Every girl born Salima, let her grow Salima. Salima here refer to the bodily integrity. The question is, do you help local organizations to develop new messages? I'm not sure if I understood your question very well, Manal. Sadia, I believe this question was meant for you in terms of on FGM, but I'm not sure if I quite...
I think the question is, do you have a unified message that's coming from the local actors? If that's correct, let me try to type it. Yeah. Yes, messaging is very important. As I said earlier, in the past, one of the challenges that we have encountered was uncoordinated message, unsolicited message, a message that was not rooted to the cause. So what we have done, we have worked with the local organizations, with the UN, and we have those key messages like FGM as a human rights. And also we have been very cognizant on the Western in ideology of FGM and the way people, they see the zero tolerance word has never been our discussions. We say in female cutting, which covers all the cutting. So we have been very strategic and tactful in terms of messaging, something that's palatable for the culture and religious also leaders, but also conveys our message to end all forms of FGM. And locals, they have a big role to participate in the framing of those kind of messages.
All right, thank you so much. Omaima, you had a question, your hand was up. We'll come to you, Siam. We'll take the last question from Siam. Omaima? Okay, let me read out Siam's question as we wait for Omaima's question. Siam asked, okay, Omaima, go on. All right.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you all presenters. My question is for the all advocates and activists. I think the most problem that are facing is that sometimes we find that we have very good constitutions, very good documents. But when it comes to laws, we find that the laws sometimes contradict coming in the constitution. Is this in the advocates' priority in how to remove this, or when campaigning for the rights of people, of women, to use this contradiction to killing the policymaker and decision making, that there is a contradiction between the laws and the constitution in order to achieve the human rights and women rights, because this is very important, because we know that sometimes the laws are not in favor of women or people's rights, while the constitution is very good. My second question also is that we are engaging different layers of the people, and one of the presenters mentioned men. I think this is very important, but also we need to engage like women, especially elder women, because they could influence some issues that we are facing as women, like FGM, child marriage, child educations, because the elder women has played a vital role in influence the process of their submission. This can be one of the plan in the future to involve this group of people, elderly women. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Omaima. For your first question, Guleid, are you okay responding to that in terms of how laws that are put in place contradict the constitution? Because sometimes the constitution, speaks on behalf of women and protects women, but then the laws contradict, the legal and key instrument.
Yeah, this is true. Africa is famous of having very nice constitutions, which they never intend to implement. So in terms of our advocacy, I think we have to be focused, not on laws, but also into political structures that are in place, because it is these institutions that make laws. If you influence them, there is a possibility of having laws that are nice. But also we need to invest more on the judiciary. We forgot on that, because constitutions are not implemented if you don't have a strong, impartial, independent judiciary. If you have independent judiciary, you will have ability to go to courts and force the parliament to repeal those that are contradictory on the constitution.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Guleid. Mama, we've taken note of your second question and suggestion to involve elderly women, because a few of the panelists mentioned how they engage men. So your suggestion is also to engage elderly women, and this is a very key and important suggestions that I think all the activists who are implementing activities on the ground will be able to implement and take into place, into practice. Just a reminder to please fill in the evaluation form. We have posted it on the chat. It's in both English and Somali. But also for those of you who would like to download and read the report, the briefing report that we just launched, we have put in place in the chat. You can also click on the tag and download the report. It's in English. And I believe there's also, it's also been written, the chat, we have something written in Somali for you to download as well. Kindly ensure to download the report, but also fill in our evaluation form. The last question, as we close up, we are about to close in about 3 minutes from Siam. I'm not sure if we'll be able to cover all the questions. How can we explain the disparity between Somaliland's strong performance how can we explain the disparity between Somaliland's strong performance in nation building and security and its ongoing challenges in achieving political inclusion, especially for women? Are there any initiatives aimed at improving this? Sarah, I'm not sure if you'd like to have a go at this question. Great. Just in a minute.
Yes, it is. Somaliland's like,
Could you
woman.
please speak up?
Is this better?
Yes,
Yeah.
much better.
Women political inclusion in Somaliland has been like the longest running case ever, but the issue really relies on the biggest challenge right now is a lot of the political power rests on clan and traditional elders. It's clan elders that do the nomination, that campaign for the candidate that they nominated, pull the funds for them, but also convince their constituency to vote for that candidate. And most of these clan elders and clan leaders have very traditional idea and views when it comes to political leadership, and they think women should not be on the running table. So that is the biggest challenge. But one of these few things that can be done and needs to be, it's like a multi-layered issue. But one thing that can be done would significantly help women political representation is gender quota would be, it's the most feasible way to have more women present at those seats is to have established a quota. Unfortunately, it's been tried, and stakeholders at the clan level, policymakers are very reluctant to it. But that is one thing that needs to be done. Another that can be helped is just awareness. We talked about civic education a lot. It's been done for 30 years, but I feel like it's not been done right, because in the last election, I was with a few women in, Las Anod area, and these women voted.
A few seconds.
So they were voting for a candidate that was recommended by their elders and their husbands. In asking them why they chose for them, they seem to be unaware that they could choose whoever they want, because that their ballot is, secret to them, and they can choose whoever they want. So having public awareness among folks,
civic education. Civic education. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for that. Siam, I hope you've taken note of that. We will not be able to take any more questions because of the time. Abdi, I see you've asked Sadia a question. So Sadia, just a yes or no would be would work well for us. Do your partners include any organizations working with persons with disabilities or minority groups? A yes or a no? Sadia? Do you work with organizations of persons with disabilities or minority groups? Maybe you can just type your response in the chat. For those of you who have not taken time to fill in the evaluation forms, kindly do so. Kindly take time to fill in our evaluation forms. We have posted them in the chat. We have it in English and in Somali. I would like to take this opportunity to thank those of you who managed to take time off your busy schedules to join us today, to join us for this particular session, and as we launch the briefing paper and as we wrap up today's discussion. It is important for us to not lose sight of the broader context in which this struggle for women's rights in Somaliland is unfolding. And although Somaliland is not officially recognized, as has been mentioned in the briefing paper, it's not officially recognized as a state and has not ratified a lot of international instruments and frameworks like the CEDAW. Its government has shown interest and has expressed a commitment to upholding the international norms and frameworks, including customary international laws that prohibit gender-based discrimination. However, we find that the repeated incidents of harassments, detention, we've heard of, activists, artists, politicians being harassed and put in detention. This incidence of harassment exposes a very clear and concerning gap between the commitments that the Somaliland government put in place, the commitment that the government has made, and the actual practice that is being put in place. And as Somaliland continues in its this particular journey towards international recognition, and we've had the panelists have mentioned that we have a new government in place, we're hoping that the activists here and those who also have a time to read into have time and an opportunity to read our briefing paper would be able to identify gaps, but also identify possible solutions or possible initiatives that they can be able to engage in. And we hope that through this journey of protecting and promoting women's rights, we hope that this is something that as activists, as international organizations, civil society, we can be able to work together on, because women's rights is not just a legal or a moral imperative. It is a cornerstone of sustainable peace, because if there's no women's rights protection and promotion of women's rights, we know that peace is going to be very elusive. And it's also very important for having, inclusive governance and meaningful development. So let today's dialogue and discussion that we've had be a step towards turning these commitments that the government has made into action. And we can only do that by, pushing the government, pushing the civil society, engaging with civil society, and also grassroots organizations from different backgrounds and different contexts. Thank you all for your engagement and continued commitment to advancing gender equality and justice in Somaliland. And we'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the Komboa Consortium for support in terms of having and seeing this briefing paper to reality. Thank you all for joining, and have a lovely morning, afternoon, or evening from wherever you're joining us. And on behalf of SIHA Network as well, thank you so much. We hope you've taken time to fill in the evaluation forms for those who are still here, and download the briefing paper. Kindly download the briefing paper. It has very important notes for you to take, and also recommendations as well. The recommendations are very key and very important, as well as the recommendations that the panelists have mentioned here in this.
dhalandhoolu geystay muxuu ciil badan dhex joojay muxuu dhalandhoolu geystay muxuu ciil badan dhex joojay muxuu marra dhaawac alla dhaawacuu baadaye muxuu dhalandhoolu geystay muxuu ciil badan dhex joojay muxuu dhalandhoolu geystay muxuu ciil badan dhex joojay muxuu marra dhaawac alla dhaawac muxuu inan dhool la moodo nin xumii dhalan rogi nafteeda midaan dhaqashaba aqooni intuu helay gaari dhowrsan muxuu cidla kaga dhaqaaqa intuu helay gaari dhowrsan muxuu cidla kaga dhaqaaqay dhalandhoolu geystay muxuu ciil badan dhex joojay muxuu dhalandhoolu geystay muxuu ciil badan dhex joojay muxuu marra dhaawac alla dhaawacuu baadaye muxuu dhalandhoolu geystay muxuu ciil badan dhex joojay muxuu dhalandhoolu geystay muxuu ciil badan dhex joojay muxuu marra dhaawac alla dhaawac muxuu inan dhool moodo nin xumii dhalan rogi nafteeda midaan dhaqashaba aqooni intuu helay gaari dhowrsan muxuu cidla kaga dhaqaaqa intuu helay gaari dhowrsan muxuu cidla kaga dhaqaaqay muxuu dhalandhoolu geystay muxuu ciil badan dhex joojay muxuu dhalandhoolu geystay muxuu ciil badan dhex joojay